Awesome. Welcome, everyone. I am excited to get into today's topic. My name is Ravi. I have been a program collaborator with Reforge for the last few years. In 2020, I helped Reforge launch the product strategy program and helped Reforge create and launch the product leadership program. I've been a senior product leader in a number of different roles. I was the chief product officer at Tinder. I led a team at Meta focused on Gen Z. I led the consumer product team at TripAdvisor. And I've managed larger product teams between 40 and 70 PMs with scope of responsibility across several hundred people. And I learned a lot about organizational design during those experiences. And that was a key topic that we wanted to make sure was covered within the product leadership program because it is so important. And ultimately, org design can be a factor in whether or not your product team succeeds. So I'm excited to get into it today and talk about some of the first principles of how to think about org design in general and how to specifically think about org design for product teams in particular. So we've got a great group today. We've already got 150 people in the session. This is definitely going to be a participatory session. So in terms of Q&A, if you have a burning question, feel free to raise your hand or jump into the chat with a comment. For most questions, put them into the Q&A. In the Q&A, we can upvote questions. You can comment on questions. And so at the end, we'll have time for Q&A. I'll go to the Q&A list and we'll make sure that we're covering the questions that are top of mind for the most folks. And so put your questions into Q&A, but if there's something that doesn't make sense, or you want to jump in with a comment, feel free to raise your hand. So just to start, I think one of the first principles that's really important is that good organization design is a tailwind to your company's strategy. It can help your team achieve impact. It can help you make decisions quickly. It can help you understand what needs to get done, how to get it done, and who to get it done with. And conversely, bad organizational design can be a headwind. It slows everything down. In particular, it slows down decision-making. It can slow down collaboration. It can make it harder to make decisions that actually create value for customers. And so ultimately, as we think about organizational design, it's one of the important tools that we have available to us in terms of thinking about product strategy. In fact, I would go as far to say that the org chart of your team is the most important strategic document for your team and for the product organization in general. And I think a really good litmus test here is to ask the question of, can we look at the org chart and get a sense of our product strategy from that org chart? And if the answer is no, that it's a very generic org chart and it looks like a lot of other companies, then that might be a problem because teams will ultimately do what they're designed to do. And by using the org chart as a strategic document, as a strategic tool, you're actually imprinting strategic priorities into the organization of your company, which makes everything much easier. The other question that I hear a lot is, I'm, an individual contributor or a new manager. Does org design really apply to me? And ultimately, I think org design applies to everyone within the organization, even making decisions about what teams should work on what. So, your goal setting process, your annual process, or your annual planning process, or making decisions about hiring someone or who to hire. Those are all ultimately decisions that are organizational decisions. And even if you're not making those types of decisions, you are absolutely impacted by the decisions around the organizational design that are made. And so it's really helpful to think about organizational design in a thoughtful way so that you can understand what are potentially the things that the org is helping us do and what is it getting in the way of. And so just to kind of get a sense for folks, I wanted to start out with a question for everyone. We'll launch a poll in a moment. The question is, in the past year, which of these org-related challenges have you experienced? And so you might have been impacted by a reorg. I know there's been a number of those in the industry recently. You might feel that you're unclear about your team's goals or other teams' goals. You might have a new manager. You might have new people reporting to you. You might have been unsure about why resources are allocated to certain teams. Your team may need resources, but it feels like the resources are going to other teams, or you might have faced challenges working with stakeholders. All of these challenges are things that are ultimately organizational design challenges. So Chris, thanks for launching the poll. We've got a bunch of answers coming in. Really interesting. Let's see here. All right, so a race for, I think the most voted for right now has been impacted by a reorg, which I think is largely a reflection of some of the challenges over the last year. I hope that that gets better in 2024. Unclear about team goals. Also, nearly half the people are facing challenges working with stakeholders. This is a really important one where, we'll talk about a bit later in this session, but ultimately the way that the product team is organized is actually something that has an impact on the rest of the company. Because if the rest of the company is organized in a different way, it just makes it harder for product to do its work. And we'll talk about some of the ways to think about that. So awesome. Thank you so much for all of the responses. Let's see. So yeah, been impacted by reorg was the number one challenge, and unclear about goals. So more than half of us are in some way or another being impacted in the past year by organizational design decisions. So let's get into that. Let's talk about some of the fundamental principles of org design, and how you can think about organizational design and make really thoughtful decisions, or react to those decisions in a way that's really beneficial to you and your team. At a very high level, from a fundamental standpoint, we can think about the fact that org design actually serves two purposes. The first is that it clarifies accountability. And this is really clear in an org chart. The up and down lines are actually lines of accountability. It's people reporting to other people based on the team that they're in, based on how their role is defined. And a strong org design ultimately capitalizes on this insight by defining teams in a way that imprint strategic priorities into the org chart. But importantly, and something that doesn't get talked about enough, is that org design, while it clarifies accountability, it also defines how teams collaborate. And so if we look across the org chart, that is ultimately the way in which teams need to work together. That might be the way that product teams need to work with each other in order to accomplish higher order product goals, or it might be the way that product teams need to work with other teams within the organization. And so strong organizational design actually aligns cross-functional communication in a way that it enables effective and clear collaboration. And these are ultimately the first principles of organizational design. We want to define clear lines of accountability, and we want to enable effective cross-functional collaboration. And this decision about what are people accountable for and how do they collaborate with others is absolutely critical for product teams. And why is that case? Why is that the case? Why is organizational design so critical for product teams? I would argue that within a technology business, it's probably more critical for product teams than any other team. And the reason is that PMs, if you think about the role, they're ultimately accountable for two things. They're accountable for driving progress on the business and effectively collaborating with the organization to achieve those progress. So ultimately, a PM's job is to lead a cross-functional set of stakeholders towards a shared goal. And in doing that work, the org chart is either a headwind or a tailwind. And so this point is really, really important. And it actually means that there's kind of two things that are at tension, two difficult things that product leaders need to do at the same time. And that is to get the cross-functional group to be accountable to a shared goal while also fostering effective collaboration towards that goal. And there's often a tension between those things because the things that people are accountable for, they want to optimize for, they want to spend time on, and that's sometimes at the expense of things that other teams are accountable for, and that might lead to a challenge in terms of collaboration. And so it's really important that we think about these two opposing forces of accountability and collaboration and how to optimize them. And I'll talk a little bit more about that in a few moments. One of the things that a lack of clarity around these two things can do is lead a team into a subpar org design. And this surfaces in a lot of ways that may not be immediately clear as org issues, but are things that I think many of us will see are common in our day-to-day work. It can lead to conflicting priorities across functions. It might feel that one team is going in one direction and the other team is going in an opposite direction. It can lead to unclear accountability for outcomes. So it can lead to product teams not knowing exactly what they're supposed to do and what success looks like. It can lead to challenges around cross-functional communication, where it's actually hard to get the support from other teams, whether it's marketing or analytics or finance, that you need in order to make product progress. And importantly, it can lead to either slow decision-making or decision-making by consensus or compromise that leads to lackluster results. And one of the ways in which you can think about this is when you have a subpar org design, it actually means that sometimes you ship the org chart to the customer. And this is a really classic example of what that can look like. And a lot of media sites are in this position now where I came to this site hoping to read an article. I don't know why about now billions of cicadas are ready to party. But I'm on the science section of Yahoo. This is the #1 article. That's the media that they worked hard to create. That's ultimately the value that I want as a customer. And yet the vast majority of pixels, the clear information hierarchy on this page is focused on ads. And so here we have a team where clearly there's two teams that are at, or clearly we have a product experience here where there's two teams that are at tension. There's the ad team trying to hit their ad goal, and there's the media team trying to create an engaging and valuable and interesting experience. And ultimately, this means that the org chart has been shipped to the customer because it hasn't surfaced in a way that actually balances those needs and creates a really good experience for the customer. It's actually gotten in the way of what the customer wants rather than enabling it. So it's really important to think about the fact that our org chart is not just a document that sits in the office, but if we're not careful, it can be something that surfaces in really challenging ways within our products. And so as product teams, we have to think about, optimizing organizational design in terms of these two opposing forces. So on one side, we have accountability, and on the other side, we have collaboration. And for product teams, we can really think about this in terms of two questions. These aren't exhaustive. There are definitely other options here, but this is a really good place to start. And so the accountability question we need to think about for product teams is, should teams be organized by feature or business outcome? And the collaboration question we need to think about is, should PMs be single-threaded owners or cross-functional facilitators? And importantly, these are both questions that need clear answers. And it's very hard to get a best of both worlds. And by trying to not make a decision on this, it often leads to a subpar organizational design. And so if we think about these two factors, accountability and collaboration in terms of outcome teams versus feature teams, and in terms of PMs being owners versus PMs being facilitators, there's actually 4 different types of product organizations that we can end up with. So one organization that's very much the kind of the trend in the industry is an outcome owner organization, where you say to the organization that PMs are accountable for business outcomes. They are ultimately the single-threaded owners on that. They do need to work collaboratively with the rest of the functional partners within the organization, but whether or not a product team hits its goals is going to be something that the PM is ultimately accountable for. And we'll take a look at each one of these in a little bit more detail. You could also have an outcome facilitator type of role, where it's not the PM that is the single-threaded owner, but actually there's a group of cross-functional partners that are co-equal and equally responsible for achieving a particular business outcome. And so if you use the term single-threaded owner or just directly responsible individual in your org, it's probably the case that you have an outcome owner model. If instead you focus on a team of equals who are ultimately have shared accountability, you're probably in an outcome facilitator model. And so, for example, when I was at Meta, that was very much in an outcome facilitator sort of quadrant within this matrix, where our team needed to work effectively with design, user research, engineering, data analytics, all to get to a consensus about what the direction was, because all of us would be held accountable for whether or not the business achieved its goals. Versus when I was at TripAdvisor, we had much more of an outcome owner model where the PM was a single threaded owner. And ultimately, the PM was going to be held accountable for whether or not we achieved our objectives. And so this is very common. We're used to now in the industry thinking about teams as being outcome oriented. But the other thing is teams can be feature oriented, and this is not necessarily a bad thing. We can have different collaboration models. You can have a feature facilitator model where ultimately the PM is responsible for bringing people together to deliver on a feature, or you can have a feature owner model where the PM has more direct accountability for the feature. And so these are a few different ways to think about how to design your org structure and make really clear choices. And very, very importantly, is there is no right answer. There are people in the industry that take dogmatic stances. You might have heard the idea that the PM is the CEO of the product, and that is an idea that positions the PM as an owner. Conversely, people have said like the PM is the CEO of nothing. They're absolutely not the CEO of the product, and that type of leader advocates for more of a facilitator model. But ultimately, there's no one right answer to this question. Each of these models has worked really well. Amazon has a more owner-oriented model. Meta has more of a facilitation model. There's been a lot of talk recently about Brian Chesky's comments about Airbnb, which is more of a facilitation model, to the point where actually the PM's role is reduced within the organization, or really more of a project management role. Any of these different organizational design archetypes can work, but whether or not they work depends on two things. Are they aligned with the problem at hand? And two, is the company, is the organization actually realistic about the model and making clear decisions around that model? So for example, there's lots of companies that try to get the best of both worlds and say, we want PMs to be accountable, but we also want them to collaborate. And that can put the PM in a really tough position. There's certain types of product work that gravitate towards different archetypes. So, a growth team is naturally going to be more in the outcome owner bucket, whereas a team that is trying to find product market fit, especially in an area where a lot of intuition is needed to actually define the connective tissue that requires the product to sort of come together and create value for customers, might be in an outcome facilitator or a feature facilitator model. And so the right organizational design really depends not just on our company, but also the type of product work that each team is doing. So importantly, every single model can work. There are absolutely successful examples of every single model. Each one has its trade-offs, and it's important to be realistic about those trade-offs. So let's dig a little bit deeper into each of these questions. And so the first question is, should a product org be feature-based or outcome-based? And really importantly, underlying this is the idea that teams do what they're defined to do. And that's a simple insight. It's something everyone knows, but it's hard actually in practice to make sure that we're accounting for that properly in org design decisions. So one litmus test question I like to ask leaders is, if we know that teams do what they're defined to do, if you stepped away from that team for a year, if the rest of leadership stepped away from that team for the year, and that team only did what they were defined to do, would they make progress on strategy? And if the answer is yes, then you have an organizational design that's really aligned with strategic priorities. But if the answer is no, or I'm not sure, then that means that the organizational design isn't actually incorporating those priorities. So this is an incredibly important decision. Let's look at an example. So, let's say you're building a social product, something like Instagram or Facebook or any other social product. One way to organize the team is around the different feature areas. You can have a team focused on friending. You can have a team focused on messaging, on newsfeed, on commenting, on groups. This is actually a pretty easy org design decision to make because in this case, the architecture of the organization actually aligns with the architecture of the product. And the architecture of the product, the way in which it's organized, the way in which features are organized is usually pretty self-evident. And so it's pretty easy to come up with an effective org design strategy organized by feature. On the other hand, we could say, no, that's not how we want to organize the product team. Instead, we want to organize it by the outcomes that we're driving for. And so instead of having a team focused on the friend feature, we have a team focused on friend discovery. And here, it's really easy to ascertain from the friend discovery team what their metric will be, what success looks like for them. For them, it'll be increasing friends per user. And so if we go back to the feature-based team, the friending team, by definition, is going to work on friending features, but they may not be really well aligned around what that means. What is the goal that they're accounting for? Which might actually be good because we may not know what that goal is. But if we're really clear that an important lever for our business is increasing the friends per user, then having a friend discovery team really crisply defines that team based on what creates success for them and what creates success for the business. So other teams might look like a messaging engagement team, which is focused on increasing messages per user, a feed engagement team, which is focused on increasing engagement on the news stories on a feed or increasing the number of news stories that a person might consume. You might have a group membership team, which is focused on increasing group membership per user. And so we could see in this example, there's actually two valid ways to organize our social product team, one based on features, the other based on outcomes, and each one has its trade-offs. And so outcome-based teams have the advantage of you have very clear lines of accountability, and the things that are important for the business are sort of embedded into the design of the team. But there's some disadvantages here. One can be sort of incrementality. So outcome-focused teams can focus too much on moving metrics and not enough on creating customer value. And these teams can hit headwinds, especially when the measure of customer value is changing. Like, let's say we go back to our social product team and we have a team focused on friend discovery. That team might have gotten it so that the average person has 1,000 friends. Getting to 1,001 friends is actually not beneficial. It might actually be detrimental to the social experience. So in that case, an outcome-based team, whereas it historically really worked for the business, might actually be leading the team in the wrong direction. For feature-based teams, we also have a set of advantages and disadvantages. One advantage is it's really easy to define a feature-based team. We know what the features are in our product, and we can create teams aligned with those features. And so this clarifies ownership around the things that we've defined as valuable within the product. It also gives teams the ability, the time, and the space to focus on different parts of that feature, regardless of whether or not it aligns with a particular metric. And oftentimes these teams work well together because they're focused on, how do these different features fit together. The disadvantage is that it requires teams to map feature work to business outcomes. And if that work isn't being done, then it can actually lead to less impactful work. And so feature-based teams tend to work on features. And it may or may not be that they're working on the right features that are leading to valuable outcomes for the business. So that's the first decision that we need to make as product teams is what is our decision about accountability? What do we want this particular team to be accountable for? Do we understand the business outcomes well enough and we want them to be accountable for those business outcomes? Or do we want to give them more space and flexibility to focus on a feature area where they may be solving for different outcomes? The next decision that we need to think through is how do we want the product team to collaborate with the rest of the organization? Very importantly, as product does not exist in a vacuum, PMs are only successful if they work cross-functionally with their peers in engineering, design, user research, marketing, and others across the company. And so ultimately, to work successfully together, teams need to understand who's responsible for making the product decisions, who's held accountable for those decisions, and how are teams incentivized to work together so that they can effectively and efficiently drive towards their strategic goal. And so at a very high level, we have two answers to this question of how do we want PMs to collaborate. The first model is the idea of a PM as an owner. So the PM is ultimately responsible for making decisions and is held accountable for those decisions. A really interesting question to ask around this to understand whether or not you're truly in an owner model is if the team hits or doesn't hit their goal, does that reflect on the PM's performance review? And if it does, then it's really important that that PM understand their role in achieving the outcome and be empowered to make decisions to achieve the outcome that ultimately is important for the business and important for their career. On the other hand, we can have a model where the PM is really the facilitator. Ultimately, their job is not to be the directly responsible individual or the single-threaded owner, but to be the conductor that's bringing together diverse perspectives, helping to drive consensus across the group of really important cross-functional stakeholders, and is leading to a direction that all of those stakeholders are bought into. And so in this case, all of the key stakeholders are co-equally responsible and accountable for the decisions that are getting made. And so this is a model that works really well when that cross-functional collaboration is incredibly important to a successful outcome. And so one of the challenges here is that, as leaders, we want to have the best of both worlds. We want our cake and to eat it too. And so a lot of PMs get stuck in this kind of mode where they're expected to be both a facilitator and an owner simultaneously. So they're accountable, but they lack autonomy. And it's really important to recognize that this is not a sustainable situation. Either it will lead to PMs, having to make decisions and ultimately, do that at the expense of their relationship with cross-functional stakeholders, or it will lead to just a lack of decision making because PMs won't be empowered to make those decisions, and the cross-functional team won't be held accountable for those decisions either. So it's really important that we're clear about this trade-off. And so there's a couple of ways that we can think about the trade-offs between the idea of PM as an owner versus PM as a facilitator. One of the advantages of PM as an owner is it just creates really clear lines of accountability. Essentially, the PM does act in this case almost like the CEO of the product. They're the single-threaded owner. They're held accountable. They're responsible for making the decisions. Of course, they need to do it in a way that's collaborative with the rest of the organization and where they are motivating the rest of the team around those decisions. That doesn't go out the window, but it does define really clear responsibility around those decisions. And that has a benefit in terms of just how quickly decisions get made and what to do if the team isn't making progress. But the big disadvantage is that taking that sort of decision can make the rest of the team outside of the product org not feel included in goal setting or product progress, or not feel committed to the decision-making process. So there's a really important trade-off with PMs as owners. It creates very clear accountability, but potentially at the expense of the rest of the organization feeling really committed. PMS facilitator, it's the other side of things. It creates a really shared sense of accountability across all contributors. It ultimately does, a lot of the work of getting teams to be aligned and to committed to a direction. But as a result, it requires the PM and the rest of the cross-functional team to get to consensus. And we know that consensus can sometimes be slow to get to. It can sometimes lead to compromised decision-making. And so it's really important that companies that create teams based on this facilitation model, think about what are the tools that we're going to enable for teams to be able to make decisions quickly when there's a lack of agreement. And that's where an idea like disagree and commit can be really important. And so ultimately, like if we think about, these different decisions that we need to make from a product standpoint, at a fundamental level, there's these 4 different archetypes that we can solve for. This is really a first step in terms of thinking about organizational design, but starting with this first step can help you answer what type of organization am I in, and what do I need to do to clarify that organization so that it helps me achieve the goals that I have for my team, and it helps me work more effectively throughout the company. There is no right answer to what exactly is the right product org. It depends on the company. It depends on the people. It depends on the type of product work that you're doing. And as your company or team evolves, you might have to switch up team structure. That's not a negative thing at all. It's natural that different team structures work better at different stages of the company. So I've got a question for all of you. What type of org represents how your team is organized? I know that there's these types of organizations in the industry. As you reflect on your own team, what best aligns with how you're organized today? Are you an outcome owner team where the PM's directly responsible for business outcomes, a feature owner team where you're directly responsible for feature delivery, an outcome facilitator where you're working effectively with a cross-functional group of stakeholders towards a business outcome, or a feature facilitator where you're working with those stakeholders and have accountability for features? So thanks, Chris, for launching the poll. Answers are coming in now. So which org type best represents how your team is organized? And lots of good questions coming in as well in the chat. Definitely put them into the Q&A as well. We're going to jump into Q&A in a moment. All right, so let's see. We've got results coming in. Interesting. It's pretty balanced. So 30% say outcome facilitator. So PM works with stakeholders who have shared accountability for outcomes. Perfect. And then we have second is feature owner. So PMs work directly to be accountable for feature delivery, which is great. And I'm actually surprised that outcome owner is less than I was expecting. So it's 15% of folks. And then 6, none of the above. So for anyone that's in that category, would love for you to put into the chat, like, how is your team organized? What defines what your team is accountable for and how they work with the rest of the organization. All right, awesome. So let's end the poll. Great. All right, so we've got the results. Outcome facilitator is the most prevalent, and then pretty equally split between feature owner and feature facilitator. I'd love to talk a little bit more about this. So when you're ready, raise your hand. And I'd love to hear the answer to, is your team organized the right way? Why or why not? And if we don't have people that want to jump in, we have a ton of questions, so we can get to that. Awesome. Elliot, let's start with you. So is your team organized the right way? Why or why not?
I would say the answer is in true PM fashion. It depends on what you're talking about. So we have a bit of a complex financial model where we're grant funded and we're like earn revenue. And we also have very junior PMs. So we've been organized in more of a facilitator, but I'm trying to migrate towards more of an outcome ownership, just as a blanket statement. So I would say yes, but for now,
Great. And how are you defining like which outcomes are the right ones? Has that been an easy process, or has that been a challenging process?
Oh, terribly difficult. We've got a couple of teams that like one team that's like earn revenue, like their products just they are the ones that bring in earned revenue, their data products actually. And so there's this shared ownership when it comes to being accountable for that revenue. And in terms of like the outcomes right now, like I've defined some of the features, since it's like a data product, is the sign up funnel itself has metrics that are kind of associated with it, right? But from a standpoint of like hitting goals, it's more of a really what sales has set as targets. So that's where it's become more facilitation with the plan to move towards more of an ownership model, if that makes sense.
Yeah, that makes total sense. And I think Elliot hit on something really important. If I just go back to, the matrix, if you have a company where there's a very clear link between changes in the product and changes in revenue or changes in business metrics. So this can be an e-commerce product where people convert or don't convert, or a travel product where people book or don't book. If there's a very clear line between a change in the product and a near immediate change in the business value, the revenue, or other business metrics, oftentimes those types of organizations really benefit from an outcome orientation. But if, on the other hand, the work that the product team does is not directly linked to sales of the product or revenue, then oftentimes a feature-oriented model works better. And so examples of businesses like that is like many of the Apple features are not necessarily going to sell more iPhones. Like if a team makes a change to the podcast app, it's not going to sell more iPhones. And so it's easier to have a feature owner or a feature facilitator model versus something like Booking.com or TripAdvisor. Product changes can have an immediate effect on revenue. And in that case, it's easier to have an outcome orientation. So thanks, Elliot. Really good point. Let's do one more. So Emilio, is your team organized the right way? And why or why not?
So it's not. We are primarily feature. So the product is a productivity tool for construction, for actual building a building. So, and the main value is all the tools in a single place. But the product came from acquisitions from 4 different products. So every team came from different companies. Every tool was in its own place. So we've had for the last 3 years very much feature owner to get that tool where it is. But the main value that people want is actually to have the outcome of everything connected with each other.
So you're in the process of transitioning to more of an outcome owner model?
Yes.
Okay. All right, great.
But the reorg is happening. But the reorg is happening right now, and this has been awesome to actually see. So I would love to hear, if you get a chance, to hear also about the role that the technology or the solution has on what org are you able to even enable or support. Or that's should not really be what's been driving the org.
I think it comes a key question is, can you define a clear set of outcomes that you can embed into the organization and feel like that represents what the org should work on? Because it does like really shape the team's activities. Or do you feel like, what the key things that the team should work on are changing often enough that you want to give them some more space? So one example is from Tinder. We had a number of outcome-oriented teams. We had a very outcome-oriented team focused on revenue, but our trust and safety team wasn't defined based on a single outcome because the vector of what is important from a trust and safety standpoint is constantly changing. And their goal was to make sure that they were working on the most important trust and safety problem, not moving a specific metric that's durable over the long term. So if your metrics are going to change more than every couple of quarters, a feature orientation is probably better than an outcome orientation. But yeah, great question. In addition, so if people are interested in going deeper on this, we have a lot more content on org design within the product leadership program that's available on Reforge on demand. We go into when to reorg, how to successfully roll out a reorg, how to think about the cross-functional impact of a reorg. In addition, I'm going to be running another cohort of leading product teams, which is a program focused on new and rising product leaders. That's going to be starting in February. That's a fast-paced program that's built on top of some of the best material from product leadership. So would love to have you take part in either one of those. We've got a few minutes left. I can stay over if people can stay over. We've got a bunch of questions in Q&A. I haven't taken a look. Chris, do you want to point out sort of the most popular question that we can start with?
Yeah, totally. And Chloe, if you're here still on the line, I'd actually it'd be fun if you came off mute and asked your question. Are you still here?
Yeah, sure. So my question is, so we're currently going through a rework company-wide, not just in product. And we have identified a set of strategies for 2024, but I'm not on the leadership team. And so as a PM, how do I influence that decision making? That's the
Yeah,
question.
it's a great question. And I think one, having these frameworks can be really helpful. Two, I think a lot of it comes down to saying, here's the value that we can create in 2024 as a team. But here's some of the challenges that we're facing based on the way that the team is currently allocated, maybe in terms of what the team's accountable for, or in terms of the resources that the team has. Ultimately, leadership, especially when they're making org design decisions, are trying to set you and the rest of the teams up for success. They sometimes do that in a vacuum. I think oftentimes we sort of assume leaders have all of the context to be able to make those decisions. If you can provide more context by being really clear about the opportunities that you see, the resources that you need, the other types of support that you need that would make you really helpful, that's a great way to inform that process so that they're making decisions with those factors in mind.
Thank you. That's super helpful.
Yeah, absolutely. Thank you, Chloe.
Awesome. Next question is from Nijat. Nijat, are you still here and want to ask your question?
Yes. Which one was it? The startup size.
Yes, exactly.
Yeah. So we're a Series A company. We closed it in June, and for last year and a half, 2 years now, we've been 6 people. So, but we're engineering heavy. So there's like 1 PM, CTO, and then software engineers. We're not 8 people, and we're right now basically like putting together an org chart. But I'm also noticing a lot of tension around, well, is this the right time? When exactly? So we proposed one and then shelved it, and now we're trying to also. So I'm trying to set up product strategy as well, and I like what you said at the beginning. Like I'm also struggling to trying to break down the product work, but I'm not able to even fit it to the org, and there's a bit of confusion. And I wonder if it's because we're too small, or need to get to a certain size, or is it never too late, too late to start? Too early.
I think it's never too early. I think every company, even a company of 2 people that's just getting started, has an org chart in the sense that there is an understanding of the roles and responsibilities between the people. The challenge is that that often happens organically based on the experience of those people, their relationship with each other. And so it's very fluid and very sort of assumed up until a certain point. But once you have, and I don't know exactly what the right number is, but I think it's probably like 10 or 15 people. Like once you get to that scale, it's really helpful to codify what people are responsible for and how those responsibilities fit together within the organization, because it just means that everyone's kind of playing off the same playbook. And the other, I think, factor in terms of org design is it's not easy to change org. There is some overhead to that. And so, doing a reorg every 3 months, it's not tenable for people. It can be very disruptive. And so a key question to ask is one of the things that makes that hard from a startup standpoint is that startups are changing so quickly. So what's the right organization for a startup that is changing its priorities every 2 weeks, every couple of months? I think an interesting question to ask is, what do we think are the durable problems that we want to work on over the next 6 to 9 months? And how can we define teams to work on those? So even though that team might be working on very different aspects of that problem, if we know what are the things that are durable and what are the things that are dynamic, it helps us set up an org chart that gets the right people focused on the right things, but also doesn't box them into working on something that was relevant 2 months ago, but not relevant today.
That was super resonant. One, I like to mention 15 because we're feeling the tension, but also not seeing enough. But even more, what is durable and trying to build towards that. That is interesting. That's interesting. Thanks.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think just from a pure human standpoint, it's helpful to create organizations that will likely last for 9 to 12 months. I think reorganizing more than that is really tough on people. And so that's like a good benchmark to start with.
Thanks.
Awesome.
Chris, should we take some more questions? Or are we at time?
Yeah, we're at time, but are you good taking maybe 2 more?
Yeah, I'm good for that. That sounds good.
Cool. The next most upvoted is from Samantha. Samantha, are you still here?
Yeah, hi. And I actually think that you have answered already, but the question was, how often do you recommend revising the organizational design? I also, in my context, I have to say we're going through a transformation so that we're not just redesigning, but also educating and really trying to understand what the setup is. So maybe there's some guidance there that you can share.
Yeah, I think that from a sort of high level standpoint, the org should be aligned with the strategy. And what inevitably happens in companies is that the strategy changes and the strategy changes faster than the org. So it creates some misalignment. Sometimes that's okay. Like that can be solved for in other ways. But if you feel like the org is enough out of line with the strategy that it's actually becoming a headwind and making things more difficult, that's a signal that a reorg might be in order, with the caveat that if the org is changing more than like every 9 months or so, and this is my opinion, there's definitely different opinions on this, it can be really thrashy because every single reorg, it requires people to form new relationships. It's actually a decent process, decently overhead process to roll things out. And so I would say reorg when you feel like the organization is out of line with strategy, and reorg as soon as possible, but not more than every 9 to 12 months.
Thank you.
And if you feel like you need to the prior question, to Najat's question, like if you feel like the team, you may need to reorg more than that because the problem is changing more than that, I think that should reflect in what the team is responsible for, so that those teams can work on those changes without having to change the org structure.
All right.
Awesome, great question.
Last question. Nijat, I'm gonna skip yours to give Channing some the mic here. Channing, are you still on? Want to ask your question?
Yeah. I'm Channing. I do consulting with Slalom. So we're usually working with like large enterprise companies doing transformation. So I wanted to get clarification on when you say the product team, do you just mean the product managers? Or are you also talking about dev and designers? Because we can reorganize a product team to be like value or outcome oriented, and if IT stays in their same structure, designs shared services, it doesn't work.
So I've principally been thinking about this through like, how is the product team organized? But you're absolutely right that the other team should reflect that organization as well. That actually has a significant impact on that collaboration component, and it can make things more difficult if the way that the PM team is organized is actually out of line with the way that the engineering or design teams are organized. We actually have in the product leadership program a full section on cross-functional organizational alignment. We talk about there's 4 different levels of solution if you feel like your cross-functional team is not aligned with how the PM team is organized. The solution that has the highest overhead, but is actually the best in terms of creating alignment, is to create squads where everyone is highly aligned and where the organizations reflect each other. But even if that's not the case, you can create working groups or tiger teams or that sort of thing, so that there is a virtual organization that kind of sits on top of the reporting structure that enables the collaboration to happen in a way where it's really aligned with the PM's team's goals. Because ultimately, oftentimes the PM team's organization is the one that's most closely aligned with strategy. And so that's the one where it's really important to create a lot of clarity in terms of collaboration and accountability.
Awesome, thanks.
Yeah, absolutely.
All right, I think we're at time, Ravi.
Awesome. Well, thank you, everyone. Fantastic questions. Really good conversation. Excited for you to dig deeper into the Reforge material. Feel free to connect with me on LinkedIn. And if you have questions, feel free to reach out to me as well. I'm in the Reforge Slack. Everyone, have an amazing holiday and a very successful 2024. Thanks for joining us at the end of the year.
Hey, Ravi, short question. Is there a video playback option just to sort of go over it once more?
Yeah.
Chris, will we do a recording?
Yep. I'll send the recording out by the end of the day, Monday.
Fantastic.
Perfect.
Thank you so much.
Thanks, everyone.
Thank you, everyone. Have a great holiday.
Thank you, everyone. Thanks,
Have a great
Ravi.
holiday.